everybody doing today? You guys were able to do some reading on Frankenstein? So what's going on with it? Was it similar or different than maybe like what you might have remembered or maybe seen before, like on a film or TV before?
Different.
Different?
Much different.
Yeah? Yeah. That's good. I mean, because I think that one of the things that you'll find as we go through the semester in our science fiction class is that there's a lot of things about science fiction that have kind of permeated popular culture and that have like been used and recycled and remixed in different ways. And so we may often have like an idea already about some of the stories that we're encountering, or maybe heard of them or see elements of them in different other sources that you're more familiar with. And that's totally fine. That's a good thing, actually, because it kind of shows how like culture cross-pollinates in lots of different ways. But we'll be talking more about that as we go through the semester. So during today's class, what I wanted to do was start off with just some announcements and some opportunities I wanted to let you guys know about. Then we'll turn our attention over to what I asked you to kind of think about before coming to class today, which is some of those different science fiction movies, films, TV shows, maybe even video games that you like enjoy and that you think others ought to check out. Because if I had you guys report back to me some of those things out loud, I'm going to report them. Originally, I would have reported them on our overhead projector, but as you know, this one would be a little shit right now. I'll use my Surface tablet and we'll record it and I'll post it up on Open Lab so everybody can get access to that list later on. And then in the last part of class, we'll return back to Frankenstein. I want to give you a few more notes about the story, find out from you some of the maybe questions you might have had about it, and we'll discuss those things together. And then we'll give like a preamble to what we're going to be looking at next, which is where we're going to be getting into the scientific romances, Jules Verne, and things like that, which will be like kind of the next evolution, historical evolution we're going to be looking at regarding science fiction. Just like our last class, I got the camera rolling in the back, just so everybody knows. After our class is over, I'll cut down the video, I'll post it up on YouTube, and make that available, so you can always review things again if you miss something. But again, like I've said before, I really want to encourage you to rely on one another for your notes if you might miss something. And one of the things that I'll talk about at the beginning of class is just another technique that you might try out for your note-taking. And also just a reminder also why note-taking is important, not just for your success in the class, for your learning, but also more pragmatically for your grade. Okay, so I know I've gone over some of that stuff, but it helps to refresh memories. I mean, if you're as absent-minded as I am, you need to have a reminder every now and again, just so you always keep things on the front burner and not let it go to the back. Now, while we get class started, I'll get the sign-in sheet going around. I see a Cornell method page right there, sir. Excellent. And so make sure you do have something to write with, make good notes as we're talking, and mention some of these other ways that we can do some note-taking in our class in a moment. So let's see. Announcements and opportunities. So after you guys get out of class and you're able to look back at our Open Lab site, I've posted a couple of things before class today. One of those has to do with the City Tech's new Writing Center. Unlike a lot of other colleges, for a long time, City Tech hasn't had a writing center. If you're not familiar with what a writing center is it's basically faculty and also some peers that have been trained that have really good writing skills that can help you with your writing in my class or any of your other classes. Doesn't matter what kind of class it is. It can even be writing, for instance, like a science class. They can help you with that. But one of the things that I make a note of is that it's not like a place you just go to and say, hey, read this and let me know if you find any typos or something. What they do is they help you become a better writer by teaching you techniques that they may help you find a pattern of mistakes in your writing. They won't identify every one, but they'll say, hey, I'm noticing like you're using this weird verb construction every single time. They'll show you some examples, but leave it up to you after you now are aware of that to go fix the rest of them yourself. The note that I put here is it's kind of like that proverb, give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. That's the idea behind how writing centers work. But one of the neat things about our school is that finally we have our own space set aside with people that can help us with this. It's not like the regular tutors that we have for other things. So put your notes, just for your own reference, that they're located in LG27. That's the library building, ground floor, room 27. So you go all the way to the bottom of the library building, what used to be called the atrium building, and there's the kind of main hallway underneath the glass where everybody hangs out. There's that hallway that goes off to the right if you're facing the direction I'm looking right now. Off to the right, they're down there. So LG27, and their hours that they're open, I know this is not ideal for us in here, are Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. until 6:30 p.m. and Friday from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. Okay, so it's only during the week, and they're not like the same hours that we got, like they're not available after our class, but if you can arrange it, try to go in there before our class. It's a good time. Now, I can also help you with writing stuff during my office hours. And I officially had my first visit to my office hours for you guys today. Leroy came to meet with me. We talked a little bit about some ideas for like his research paper. So I encourage everybody to also take advantage of that throughout the semesters. I mean, that's what I'm sitting over there for. I may be occasionally eating like today because I've had meetings today since like 8 in the morning. I'm actually very tired right now, but as you can see, I'm trying to bring all the energy that I can to make sure that this class is a success for you guys right now. But sometimes we do have to multitask, right? I think we all have to do that sometimes. All right, so that's about the note-taking. Another thing I wanted to mention to you guys I put up here is a writing contest. So I've already mentioned to you, like in I think our second class, or maybe even our first class, was crossing down with the Literary Arts Festival that we have here at City Tech. That has a deadline coming up March 1st. If you've written anything, while you've been here at City Tech, like another class, submit it. Because I guarantee you got a good chance of actually winning one of the prizes, or at least ranking in one of the prizes, which not only gives you some accolades, but that's something that you can put on your resume. That can make you look good and be able to prove you've got communication skills, which matters a lot in the workplace. Now, the thing I posted today that I wanted you to know about is an opportunity from Arizona State University, one of the more prestigious state schools here in the United States, is offering a climate fiction contest. And this particular contest is sweeter than the Literary Arts Festival because there's prize money involved. First place is $1,000, and then there are going to be 9 finalists. So I mean, even if you don't win the first place, you can say like you're one of the finalists, and you get $100. And what this contest is about is you write a short story, no more than 5,000 words. It's actually a very, very short story. But you write it about something that relates to climate change. It could be something you've experienced yourself or that you observe going on in the world around us. Like for the fact here in New York City, we're 15 inches below our average snow yield for the season. How sea levels are rising, which is like a big problem, not just here in New York City, especially whenever we have big storms, like the Sandy, but also like from my hometown, which is on the Atlantic coast, Brunswick, Georgia, St. Simon's Island, Jekyll Island. All those places are having to deal with this right now in order to preserve the coastline, houses and all this kind of stuff. It's a big problem. But basically, you make up some kind of story about it that's relating to that in some way. Send it off. You're going to be in the pool of submissions. You got a chance to win. If you don't put in anything, you obviously don't have any chance of winning anything at all. But one of the things I like about this contest, and I want to warn you guys about, there are exceptions to this rule. But by and large, as you're listening for like writing opportunities that may be a writing contest of some kind, always research like who's sponsoring it, because you obviously we want to make sure whoever's sponsoring is someone that's reputable, but also that there isn't an entrance fee. There's a lot of writing contests. Like if you were to go to Barnes & Noble right now, and you walk into the magazines and you go to the far right, I'm talking the one over here on Court Street, far to the right, the back corner over there is where all the writing magazines are. They have a whole rack of them. You can find all the science fiction magazines there, like Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, Analog Science Fiction, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Interzone from the BBC, I'm tired, from the UK. All these magazines are over there. There's also magazines just simply about the craft of writing, like how to sell your writing, how to enter writing contests, all that kind of stuff. Well, there's a lot of contests out there that you can enter, but they like entrance fees. And a lot of those I don't agree with. And I don't think you should be like shelling out a lot of money in the hopes of winning. You should look for those places that are going to that have some sort of sponsorship in order to give prizes, rather than relying on you to pony up some money in order to enter. You shouldn't have to pay to play on those kinds of things. As I've mentioned, like in our very first class, I'm going to keep telling you guys about these kinds of opportunities. I'm not expecting you guys to all be like fiction writers in the class. You don't have to be. I'm not a fiction writer. I just write you scholarly stuff. But I do know that a lot of my students have an interest in this, so I want to mention these kinds of things and things that are more widely maybe interesting or useful to you guys as well. So I'm not trying to lose anybody by thinking like, what the fuck does he keep talking about these writing contests? It's something that may be beneficial for some folks here. All right, so that's the two opportunities that I posted. After class, I'll be posting the video for the lecture we'll have in a little bit. Let's see. A couple things we'll talk about reading, and then the last thing I just wanted to mention briefly had to do with your note-taking. So I've already talked about the Cornell method of note-taking, right? Which you guys already know about. Where you take your page, you're going to divide it up thus, where you got one side over here for like all your topics, or we might say keywords, right? And over here we got all of our details that pertain to those topics and keywords. And then after you've completed your notes, like after class, you go back and you write a couple of sentences summarizing what's on that page of notes. That way you can very quickly review what you've been taking notes on later, which is going to be like important at the end of the semester when we have our final exam. But as I said also, and as you know from the syllabus, part of your grade in the class is dependent on good note-taking. And I'm just looking for best effort. I'm not going to be going through and seeing like, this person like forgot, like you mentioned this point or missed this one thing. But I'm going to be looking for best effort, seeing like that you put in some energy into making some good notes. But if you had some big glaring holes, obviously you use the videos that I post on YouTube, or you relied on one another to copy each other's notes, which I told you is fair game as long as you put them into your own writing, or you type it up on your own, by your own hand on a computer, right? Then I'll be collecting those, right? Midterms, that's how your midterm grade is calculated, besides the weekly after-class writing assignments. And then part of the final grade in the class will come from all the notes that you've done. You can give me your originals, which I'll give back to you. For the midterm, I'll give that back to everybody. But then the last collection at the end of the semester, you just have to see me after the new semester starts. I can give it back to you then. Or you can always give me copies, whether it be electronic, digital PDF, any of those types of things, totally fine as well. As long as I can read it in some way, and it's obviously by you. So again, that's something that's really important. Now, for today's class, because I mentioned that I'll occasionally talk about other ways that you might take notes. Cornell method, I think, is par excellence. This is like the Cadillac of note-taking, okay? The two things I wanted to mention to you. First thing is this thing called the sentence method. Now, the sentence method is a little bit harder work, but during a class, especially a long lecture, this actually can make it a little bit easier for your note-taking. The way the sentence method works is basically as you hear me talking about something, you try to capture that in a statement or a sentence. Something that's got a subject, a verb, and an object, right? A full sentence construction. Like it might be something like Frankenstein likes to whine. Okay? Point of fact, that may be something that I say later on. You put that down as a sentence. And you keep writing as many sentences as you can during the lecture about different things that we're going to discuss. But this is where obviously it's a little bit harder than the Cornell method, where in the Cornell method you're trying to group things already around cue words, those things where I pause and say, now we're going to talk about how Frankenstein relates to X, or we're going to talk about this character. Those would be cue words. Those would be things you put over on that left column. Whereas the sentence method, there's no real organization. It's like a memory dump, right? And so after the fact, you have to take your notes and put them into something that has more order. This could be something like an outline, where you got like topic 1, you got a subtopic, then you have subtopics, right? I mean, you're familiar with outline. You've all done this in writing classes, I'm sure, at some point in time. But the idea is that you take all this information that you've captured in the sentence method and then essentially compile it, like you are compiling like source code into an executable. You're doing that by making that information more actionable, right? You're making it so it's easier to understand what's going on than just like a whole mess of notes, right? So this is the sentence method. And again, I don't have like any kind of like method that I'm going to require you to do, because each person kind of has to figure out what works best for them. But I can tell you that from my own experience, that it's with the sentence method where I got my start in making better notes before I then graduated later over to the Cornell method. And that's just because, I'm maybe not the brightest color and crayon in the box, okay? You guys may probably have a leg up on me on that. So either of these are good, and there are others that we're going to discuss later in the semester, but I do want to give you some of these options if you haven't seen them before. And some of them can be obvious, but at the same time, it's something I know from my own experience. It took me a while to figure out what worked best for me. So maybe my difficulty might be something that you guys can learn from without having to go to the same school of hard knocks that I did. Oh, one last thing I wanted to mention to you about notes. Make sure on your notes that you're always putting the date at the top of each page, right? I mean, you may already be doing that, but if you don't, it's a really easy way to make sure you don't get lost. Like if your notes get out of order, if like you're taking them out of a spiral-bound notebook or something, that by having that date on the top, it makes it relatively easy to figure out like, what's what. And obviously if you put a date and also a page number, I mean, today you're starting, you're making notes, the date is the, what is it? The
19th.
19th already. So you put the date, and then you can say like page 1, or you put a 1 off to the side of the date. This is the first page of notes for today's date. As you flip over, put a 2. Turn over, you put a 3. That way you can always keep track of where your notes are, as you may need to reorder them in different ways, put them in different types of notebooks that work best for you. Any questions? You guys hanging in there? I know it's kind of warm in here. We got the windows cracked. There's a lot of noise outside, but that's kind of what we have to do. So we got that. And what's the last thing that I want to talk about before we get into your discussion? I wanted to show you guys this. I'm going to pass it around. This is Locus. Locus is a very old magazine about the science fiction field. So in Locus, there's articles about science fiction writers, like interviews with them, and also about different science fiction events. Well, why this might be interesting to us today, this is the latest issue, February 2020. I just picked it up at Barnes & Noble last week. is that, so over on page 9, celebrating 90 years of analog. This is a very, as you see, 2/3 page, very short article though, about City Tech's 4th annual City Tech Science Fiction Symposium that we held last fall. You can see that editors, both past and current, of Analog Science Fiction magazine, and then you can see some of the names of folks that are involved, kind of helped organize. We have people like my colleague Lavelle Porter, also listed here. So you may want to check that out. You can see pictures of people presenting, like over here on the right-hand side, a very small picture, but you can see Lisa Yasek. She's someone that I'll talk with you guys a little bit later this semester when we get to feminist science fiction. She's my former professor from Georgia Tech. She came up and presented a paper here. And then over here on the right, you can see Frank Wu, who is a science fiction artist turned science fiction writer. He's married to Brianna Wu, who you may know because of Gamergate, but he came out and read one of his stories for us at the symposium. So I'll pass this around so you guys can take a look at it, and you can flip through it. You might see some other things that are interesting in there. All right. And then the last thing. I just want to reiterate something I've said before to you guys about the readings. I don't want the readings in the class to be overly burdensome to the point where you just simply either don't do the reading or you don't make a good attempt at the reading. Because I know that with this class, there's a lot of reading involved. So it's a writing intensive class on top of that. But any way that you can improve your chances of being able to understand a story, of being able to maybe get a little bit more out of a story, I want to encourage you to do so. So you can rely on a lot of different resources online in order to help fill in gaps that you might have or questions you might have about the readings. Or also simply to be able to help yourself move on if maybe you can't complete a reading. Now, I mean, in an ideal world, I want you to do all the readings. I think it's beneficial for you. I mean, this kind of thing is what builds your ability. Just the same way that I said that writing is a skill that we develop through a lot of work. Reading is also a skill that we develop through a lot of work. There's, you can take speed reading classes, but it's not necessarily the same type of ability that you build from like years of concentrated effort reading to become a very efficient and deep reader. Because like with speed reading, my grandfather, something he learned during World War II, it's a class he took aboard the Enterprise, the ship that he was stationed on. But whenever he was reading, he's basically reading for enjoyment. He's not like trying to think about like what the story might represent or what the story might mean. Not only to yourself as a reader, but to other people as well. And so that's a part of the skill that I want us to be working on this semester. And so if we're focused not just on simply getting through the story, in order to get that extra depth, that's where we can begin relying on these outside sources. So don't be afraid of like using Wikipedia to look up like a story summary. Or maybe there's the Cliff Notes website. As you're probably well aware, there's a lot of people that just like to blab away on YouTube about everything under the sun, including science fiction stories. So I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can gain access to some insight, not only into Frankenstein, but all the stories that we're reading in this class. And if you want to, you can also share some of those resources whenever you're doing your weekly write-up. And you say, as I was reading Frankenstein, I looked up some background about the story from this site. You can include that link whenever you're posting your after-class writing assignment. Not so much for my benefit, but everybody else has access to read what each other have written. Because I expect that you can actually obviously learn something from one another because you're all super bright people. You're sharing different perspectives. Because every one of you are going to be coming at this from a million different directions. And so instead of it all just coming from me, those things that you guys post on our Open Lab site, there's no reason you can't also read those things. And maybe if someone shares a link, you can click on it too and see like what that might offer you. It might help out. It might not. But it's something that's worth checking out and maybe also considering sharing if you do run across stuff that might be beneficial. All right. Questions? concerns, complaints? Oh yeah, make sure you always sign in. If you ever forget, you can always grab it later in the class. All right. So the first thing that I thought we could do, if you have it with you, you can pull out that list of definitions that I gave you last week, or the week before. If you don't have it with you, it's okay. You can make a note in your notes of some of the things that I'm going to reference. But I thought we could take a look at some of these definitions together. Not all of them, because obviously there's a lot of them on there. But we can take a look at some of them. Think a little bit about like what science fiction means in a general way, and then you guys can report back to me some of the things that you enjoy that science fiction, or that you think that other people like yourself should be checking out that science fiction. So the first one I want to take a look at, and I may have read through this particular one in our last class, but in case I didn't, or also just to refresh your memories. Look in the middle column at the top on the first page, right under where it says chronological list of definitions of science fiction. And you see the first one there starts Hugo Gernsback. So this particular definition, as I mentioned before, is the very first definition that anyone ever wrote about science fiction. So Gernsback, an immigrant from Luxembourg, fresh off the boat here in New York City, having started an electrical supply company, having founded several magazines, some of which were devoted initially to selling his electronic components and giving instructions on how to build your own radio, or instructions on how to build some rudimentary types of, even back then, you have to imagine, if you wanted something that ran off a battery, you probably had to build your own battery. And he would give you the instructions and also offer to sell you the supplies to do that. So he began thinking if I want people to be building and inventing all these neat new inventions that people are coming up with, I need to inspire them as well. And that's where he started thinking of this new genre that he called science fiction. That's something that we'll talk more about later, but go ahead and put this in your notes. It's a very clunky word. One word altogether, science fiction. And in April of 1926, in the very first issue of a magazine that he started called Amazing Stories, the idea was to inspire people with these stories about the future, stories about new inventions. And so as a part of that, where does that inspiration come from? Where does the engagement come from? That's where we have his definition to help us a little bit. And he says, quote, by science fiction, I mean the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and Edgar Allan Poe type of story. A charming romance, and as I mentioned before, a romance in this case means an adventure story. It doesn't mean the modern connotation of a romance novel. A charming romance, so an adventure story, intermingled with scientific fact. So it's has to be based on things that we actually know about science and technology. And prophetic vision. What do we mean by prophetic? What does that word mean, prophetic?
Something that's destined to happen.
Something destined to happen? This is right. Other ways of phrasing that for other folks? Yeah.
A prediction of the future events.
Exactly. Both of these things. Something that's destined and someone that has to be able to foresee what that future might be and to report it to people, right? So he says that science fiction has to be a mixture of these three things. The charming romance, the scientific fact, and prophetic vision. He continues, not only do these amazing tales make tremendously interesting reading, they're always instructive. And one of the things you'll find in his own writings of science fiction or science fiction is that he really goes into detail about how these things would actually work. He tries to think through how these inventions might work, how you might actually build some of those things. Partly because he wanted to fuel people's imaginations, but also he wanted people to buy his electrical parts that he was selling on the side. So a very pragmatic person. They supply knowledge in a very palatable form, meaning that that knowledge is not as dry as what you're receiving right here in my class, where you're thinking, oh my God, it's so hot, Professor Ellis is droning on, I just want to go to sleep, I want to be a million miles from here. So yes, I understand, this is not a science fiction story, unfortunately. But he's saying that these stories can do that for us, that we can learn something from these really exciting stories. New adventures pictured for us in the science fiction of today are not at all impossible of realization tomorrow. Many great science stories destined to be of historical interest are still to be written. Posterity, you're thinking of your future looking back, posterity will point to them as having blazed a new trail, not only in literature and fiction, but progress as well. So he really saw science fiction as being this literature that helped us see the future, to visualize that future, to imagine what it might be like if we have new science and new technologies based on what we know today. So it's not something fantastic in the sense of things like magic or dragons, things that aren't rationally explainable. But that it's something that's based on what we actually know and can figure out about the universe that we inhabit. Now, let's take a look at a couple more. Look over on the third column, over on the right. There's one there about halfway down by John W. Campbell Jr. John W. Campbell Jr. Got two of them in a row. Let's look at that second one. Actually, both from 1947. But this is the one that's a little bit lower than half page. John W. Campbell Jr. is someone we're going to talk about later this semester, from the golden age of science fiction. Also based here in New York City. He's probably single-handedly one of the most influential science fiction editors of all time. He edited Astounding Science Fiction, which became Analog Science Fiction, which is still published to today. But what he was very good at was developing ideas and working very closely with his writers, the writers that wrote stories for him, to develop their stories, to make them better. And he's not just sitting in his office waiting for people to send him stuff. People are visiting him in the office and they're talking through the ideas, and he's helping them make those stories that much stronger, which I think is why he's remembered so fondly, at least as an editor. There's other things that's wrong with him as a person that we'll talk about. But at least as far as his editorial work, he did some really important things to push the genre forward, to make it better than it was more toward the beginning with Hugo Gernsback. So this definition Campbell gives us, quote, scientific methodology involves the proposition that a well-constructed theory will not only explain every known phenomenon, but will also predict new and still undiscovered phenomena. Science fiction tries to do much the same and write up in story form what the results look like when applied not only to machines, but to human society as well, end quote. So what's going on with this definition is, first off, he's building this parallelism between science fiction and actual science. He's saying that in science we build theories that we use to explain stuff that we've observed in experiments, but also to predict what we haven't yet discovered. If you imagine back to the beginning of the 20th century, and Einstein developed his special and general theories of relativity, those theories weren't yet substantiated until later. And many of his predictions are still being shown to be true because no one had devised an experiment yet to test some of those things. His theory predicted different types of things that we're observing today. Imagine that something someone thought up almost 100 years ago, or really 100 years ago. It's hard to imagine it's 2020 now. But 100 years ago thought up some of these things, and what he developed both through the math behind his ideas is something that's still practical and useful today. And we're still using and reaping a lot of fruit from what he thought of in some of the experiments that we're doing to try to figure out like how our universe works. So Campbell's saying, just like science does that, science fiction does it too. That we're applying some of these ideas to imagine what the world might be like. What might be some of those future technologies? What might be like encounters with alien life forms? But I think the most important thing that he mentions here is at the end of that definition, is that we're not just trying to imagine new rocket ships, new ray guns, untold forms of alien life. But what science fiction does is it always brings it home. It's always about thinking and showing, what do these new sciences and technologies do to people? What do they do to society? What do they do to individuals? Because why would we be interested in any kind of story unless it did have something to do with us? And at its heart, science fiction is always about people. It's people that are being influenced by our science and technology. And maybe to use a term also that it doesn't come from Einstein, but it's a term that he popularized.
That's one word?
That's one word.
Wow.
So if one thing that you may not know, like with German, the neat thing about German language is that they're very good at taking separate words and sticking them together into one single new word to mean something new. In some cases, they will put like a shit ton of words together and make something really crazy new. But this is a combination of two words that Einstein's working with here. We got Gedanken, and we got experiment. Experiment, you guys, you know what that is, right? What does Gedanken mean? Anybody have any idea? Gedanken. Weird word. Makes me kind of smile when I say it, Gedanken. Gedanken is thought. It's about thinking. So if we split it up into English,
Thinking experiment.
thought experiment, exactly. And so for Einstein, if you can imagine like the turn of the century, he's this patent clerk working in a Swiss office in the Swiss bureaucracy. I mean, when you got like do this kind of bureaucratic dead-end job, I mean, what else you got to do besides like pushing papers around? You're gonna let your mind wander. And he's using that time to imagine things. He's thinking, like, as one does, about scientific phenomena. He's thinking about the world. But he's thinking about it from different perspectives. He's trying to reason through what may seem apparent based on old theories of physics, things that come to us all the way from like Sir Isaac Newton in like the 1700s, and saying, is that really right? If it is, it's very like paradoxical, it's very strange. Maybe things work a little bit differently. And so he would use thought experiments to question what we know and to help him visualize new theories that he would then have to elaborate on with the mathematics of physics, which are much more abstract than you're just thinking about something as a thought experiment. But I mentioned this term because this is a good term to think about how science fiction works. In science fiction, you can say, is a thought experiment. It's imagining what the world might be like in the future, or what aliens might be like, or what things, what new science and technology might we have 100, 200, millennia from now, okay? All of these are thought experiments, trying to imagine how things are. Another word that I want you guys to know to help us like work through like what science fiction is extrapolation. Make sure you get that in your notes. Anybody know what extrapolation means? Or what it means to extrapolate, just to look at the verb form. Extrapolation or extrapolate.
To extend forward.
To extend forward is a good way of putting it. And whenever we extend forward, where, like, what do we extend from?
Like whatever you have, the pattern of it.
It could be a pattern, it could be like a starting point, it could be initial conditions, right? So you need a place to start from. And what science fiction, at least the good science fiction, always does, is it starts from what we know. Because that's something that's kind of irrefutable, right? It's something that like we can have like as a foundation. But from that, we extrapolate, we reach out, we're looking forward from those initial conditions, from that starting point, to imagine how things might be. So like, if we take, for example, like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I mean, I love high fantasy, which is the type of literature that we call that kind of collection of works. But at the same time, there's no extrapolation from anything that we know about the world to explain the Balrog, to explain how magic works, to explain, like, if we go back to The Hobbit, the dragon in the Misty Mountains. These are things that we can't extrapolate based on what we know about how the world works. So this is something that we say is fantasy, something that isn't necessarily rooted in our known science and technology. But I will say, not to complicate things too much, is that some writers and filmmakers, etc., do take some starting conditions of things that we know, like say, for example, evolution. They'll take that idea and apply it to, like, say, a different world. And on this other world, because there are different affordances and constraints, there's different forces working on the biology of the animals and the flora that are there, are then producing, through evolutionary forces, say dragons, or what we would call dragons. And they are making something we normally think of as fantasy, science fiction, by using science to explain how those things might have come about. Now, magic and that's a heavier lift. Not to say that it doesn't happen. We're going to talk about later Arthur C. Clarke, who, one of the things that he talked about before is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? You may have heard this before. There's an idea that, like, I mean, if like, say, aliens were to visit us from another world, right? They're probably going to have technologies that would seem like magic to us because we have no fucking clue how they might work. Because they may be like wondrous inventions, doing amazing things. Doesn't mean that there might not be an explanation, but at least how it's perceived by us would be as if it were magic. Let's see, there's one other I want to take a look at. Because we'll go through more of these as the semester goes on. And I would encourage you, when you have time, to look through these and read through them and think about them. All this. I like this one. So this is on page 2, over on the left-hand side. Toward the bottom, Rod Serling. Maybe you've seen like the old black and white Twilight Zone. That's Rod Serling. That was, he made that show.
On Netflix?
Do they have the old black and white version on there too? I know they have like, isn't there like a new Twilight Zone series that's held by Jordan Peele? Yes. Which, I mean, he's obviously influenced by some of these older stories that Rod Serling, some of them he wrote, others were written by other science fiction writers that he contracted with. And Rod Serling himself was also a writer of science fiction. But in this definition, he writes, fantasy is the impossible made possible, or made probable, I'm sorry. Fantasy is the impossible made probable. Science fiction is the improbable made possible. So he's like, in a sense, like splitting some hairs there by what we mean by some of these words, but I think it kind of makes clear how these different things operate. That fantasy otherwise would be things that we consider impossible. Like magic is not, I mean, I can't say an incantation and it's going to produce some kind of results. I can't make a wand that's going to give me some sort of power, whether it be levitate a feather or to do battle with some evil dark lord. But it makes it seem probable. Whenever I read the Harry Potter books 3 years ago now, I couldn't put the books down. Because I mean, to me, it was like a very enjoyable story, but the way that J.K. Rowling was developing what was happening in the stories did seem, as outlandish as it was, probable to me. But then he goes on with science fiction is the improbable, meaning things that don't seem likely, but have to be rooted in some kind of possibility, right? That it's the improbable made possible. That it's something that through the story, through what we see on the screen, it seems like it's actually real. I mean, probably the best illustration of this is when we watch like a science fiction film that has lots of special effects and all the trickery that goes into making those special effects seem so real. I mean, whenever, not too long ago when I was talking with Neil deGrasse Tyson about my lifelong love of Star Wars, for me it was the special effects that initially grabbed me. Whenever I'm a little kid watching the TV screen, I'm just sitting on the floor watching the TV, and in one of those early trailers for The Empire Strikes Back, so this is like 1980, seeing the Falcon bank around in between the asteroids in the film, it just seemed like this was reality. I mean, besides me being a little kid, the way it looks on the screen is just like, this is possible. Doesn't mean that it actually is, at least yet, but it's something that science fiction is capable of producing that idea in our minds. To produce that feeling also. We think of it as very affect-driven, that feels like this is something that's really possible.
I feel like Blade Runner is like the perfect example for this.
Yeah, can you say like why you think that?
Well, Blade Runner, basically, if you guys don't know, is like advanced AI that are on this planet, and just seeing that movie is just so probable, something that definitely could happen like the next 10 years, not 20. So that seems just realistic to me. That's not too far out.
Right. And this is a really good example that you bring up with Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. These are actually, at least the original Blade Runner is based on the Philip K. Dick novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? From the late 60s. And both in that original novel, but then even more so on the screen, we're able to see some of the images that Philip K. Dick originally wrote. But it makes it, I think, more real to us when we can see not just like the scenes in the film, but then also see the people and the androids essentially act indistinguishable from one another, right? And so this is one of the first things that I'm going to put down on our list is Blade Runner. I think it's a great example to lead off with.
It's on Netflix.
In that case, what about Daemon Ex Machina, where there's an inventor that made a robot that has an AI in it, and at the end of the movie, she actually blends in with society, but it's a mech. It's an android at the end of the day.
Right. This is another good example, and it's building on some of these ideas that have been percolating, I think, in popular culture about certain anxieties that we feel about our relationship to technology. There's actually a lot of people that have written about this anxiety and that relationship for decades now. But with some of these newer movies like Blade Runner 2049 and with Deus Ex Machina, we're seeing these things continue to be a concern to us. And you also think about like how it's becoming more of an issue with some of our newer technologies that are being deployed now, like self-driving cars, for example. Because there's issues, not just in terms of like the fact that they display a modicum of intelligence, but because they have intelligence to navigate the road, they're also having to make decisions that normally we would reserve for human beings. So like if you can imagine, you might have heard of this, like if you've taken a philosophy class, it's called, I think it's called the trolley problem. Anybody familiar with that?
Yes.
Can you describe it a little bit?
I can't remember it too well, but I know it's like the trolley's on two separate paths. Either it kills, I think, 3 people on one side and 1 person on the other side, and it's your job to flip it or not. And then you're in the corner, and it's your job to choose who moves.
And you're exactly right, that you're making this choice, but what's problematic is whenever we give that decision-making power to a computer, right, to an AI, an algorithm basically running on silicon, controlling the trolley. So if we think of this trolley instead as like a Tesla running down the road with autopilot on, and it encounters some kind of obstruction, it makes a decision about where it should go to avoid that. But what if that decision is made maybe not fully understanding what other ramifications, what are the other consequences of that action? And with the human being, we're not to say we're by any means perfect in our decision-making ability, but how we're going to make decisions that may value life in different ways, whether we're prioritizing the life of the person in the car over people walking on a sidewalk. How we decide that's going to be a lot different maybe than the way just like an algorithm would make that decision. You're right.
Now that you mention that, it brought to mind, I like to play chess. And so when the computer decides to make its move, one thing I tested, and it doesn't seem to understand sacrifice too much. You know what I mean? It's based on a long series of algorithms that'll get it to its end point, but it doesn't seem to quite understand the sacrifice of maybe a queen or something like that. It would prefer not to do that and try to go around another method.
I see. Great. And so in different ways we think of, and I think it's also true of like other video games, like how the AI may be controlling like NPCs in the game, NPCs, non-playable characters that you may be fighting against or interacting with in different ways, are going to be governed by different rules that don't necessarily jive with like what we may think. A really good example of this, you may want to put your notes to just kind of think ahead on, especially for some of you that may be interested in like computer-based or computer-oriented science fiction stories. One of the things that we'll talk about later this semester is a book called Neuromancer. You might have heard of it before.
I'm trying to read that.
It is a tough slog the first time you go through it. Neuromancer. And it's by William Gibson. William Gibson. And William Gibson, actually, he's an interesting science fiction writer, because he's actually from the American South. That's where he spent some of his developmental years. But then the Vietnam War happened, and he hightailed it to Canada so he wouldn't get drafted. And he's lived in Vancouver ever since then. So the Canadians like to claim him as like Canadian science fiction writer, and U.S. Folks from the South would like to claim him as a Southern writer, because there are certain aspects of his writing that do lend credence to that, because he grew up in Appalachia, like on his mom's side of the family. But in Neuromancer, the reason I mention it is that part of this, where the story really, the whole plot is driven by these two artificial intelligences. And in the story, Gibson's imagining a future where artificial intelligence is highly regulated. The government does not want AI to reach a point where it has human-like intelligence. Then it is able to act on the world based on what it knows. But these two AI that have been separated because the way they were designed is that if they were to combine, that they would have human or even exceeding human intelligence. And what we find out in the story is that we may make assumptions about the motivation of other people. We don't really know what would motivate an artificial intelligence that has that kind of intelligence, that is able to think on a level at or above human beings. Because you imagine artificial intelligence is totally unlike what we are. It's a program or a series of programs running on computer hardware, is embodied in some way on silicon. But what it wants would not be the same things as what we want. I want right now, I would really like a cold glass of Coca-Cola on ice. That's what I want right now. But for artificial intelligence, that means shit. They don't need that. They don't want that. So you have to imagine their motivations, their desires, in a sense, will be totally unlike our own. And that's one of the main ideas that Gibson tries to put forward in this book, is that he sees artificial intelligence a little bit unlike Blade Runner, and a little bit unlike Philip K. Dick, who saw essentially human beings becoming more machine-like in the way that we work in bureaucracies and we follow all these rules. And the androids are becoming more human-like, that they have emotion, they want to be free, they want to be able to have agency over their own lives. Well, what Gibson's saying is it's not really like that they're not going to think like us. They're going to be unlike us. In the same way we can imagine alien life would be unlike us, because their language and society and culture would develop in a completely different way than our own does, and did. But these are the kinds of things that we can explore in science fiction in a way that maybe we can't explore in other kinds of fiction. That always has to be rooted in the here and now. And that's a good term that I just mentioned that you guys ought to know. Here and now. Make sure you put that in your notes. When I say here and now, or the here and now, using the definite article, the here and now is right now. It's what our world is like. It's who's president, what's in the news, what's dealing with the coronavirus, all that stuff. That's the here and now. And when I mentioned the term extrapolation before, extrapolation begins always with the here and now. That we're always basing what we're writing or what we're seeing in a movie on the here and now. And so one of the rules, or one of the things that we can take away from this, maybe, and this is really looking far ahead, just to kind of plant the seed in your minds right now about it, is that all science fiction, okay, all science fiction, doesn't matter when it was written, in the past, present, the future, even though it may be about the far future, at its core, it's always about the time in which it was written. Because the only way any writer can ever write anything is based on what the writer knows, what the director, the filmmaker knows. So all science fiction is always about the here and now. It can be imagining cool things in the future, and certainly those things might turn out to be prophetic. They might be inspiring, and that's good. But at its heart, at its core, it's always about the here and now. So that was a little digression. But we started here with some things you guys are thinking about, interested in. So we got Blade Runner, Deus Ex Machina. What are some other TV shows, movies, video games you think are
that involve AIs?
not just involve AI, any kind of science fiction that you think is something we all should maybe check out, something that we all should know about or look into? Yeah.
Cloud Atlas.
Cloud Atlas, yes, that's excellent, both book and a film. Yeah, the series that you were mentioning in last class, right? Others.
Travelers.
Is that a TV show or?
It's on Netflix. It was a series on Netflix about AI sending like people from the sort of like a Terminator type of thing, people from the future into the present to sort of try to change the future.
I see.
But they don't really send people; they send just their subconscious into host bodies.
Oh, neat.
Right.
I was just talking to my friend, he just was visiting from China, but apparently everyone knows the movie The Arrival.
That's a good movie.
He's a new science fiction writer, and I think he's writing a trilogy called The Three Bodies, which is supposed to be really good and groundbreaking. But I forget the author's name.
It's actually two different people. So
Oh, okay.
The Arrival, it's actually an American writer. His name is Ted Chiang. And we'll actually, I may mention him in our lecture today.
Okay.
He wrote a story called Story of Your Life. And Story of Your Life is what got turned into the movie Arrival. Ted Chiang's a really nice guy. I had lunch with him a while back when I first moved up here to New York. Because I did a favor for him like when I worked at Georgia Tech. Unlike here at City Tech, Georgia Tech has this thing called the first year experience, where all new incoming freshmen will have a book that they have to read, and then there's a series of lectures and events that take place over the year about that book. And I was able to convince them that they needed to use Ted Chiang's story called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling. It's a different story, but also a really good one that I use in some other classes. But yeah, Ted Chiang's excellent. Can't go wrong with anything that he's written. And the cool thing about Ted Chiang, he specializes in short fiction. So
I was going to use that.
because like, then you have to like read like through something really long, he like gets to the point with the story. Now, Three Body Problem, you're right. This is like, you know, a groundbreaking Chinese written science fiction. It's been translated into English now. I think it's by Xixin Liu. Let me check. And again, I apologize for the computer projector not working, because then I would be pulling all this stuff up, whereas right now you just see me like typing things in. Three Body Problem.
I literally bought that book yesterday.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some friend told me to buy it.
And what you might consider, that might be what you use for your final essay project. Let's see, part science fiction novel by the Chinese writer Liu Xian, C-I-X-I-N. It's like really popular, and actually before, you know, I guess one of the things, like I'm not saying this to disparage, you know, President Trump. He just does things obviously a lot different than our earlier presidents, all of them included. But with President Obama, he always had an annual book list. And he still releases a book list. It's like all the books he's read the past year that he thinks other people ought to check out. And The Three Body Problem was on his list before he left office.
It's a 3-part book, right?
Yeah, it's got 3 parts to it. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. My wife read it. You know, she's Taiwanese, so she read it in the original Chinese, and she said it's very good. One day, if I ever get the time, you know, I'll try to read it as well. The thing about like the English translation, let's see if it says here. I know that the translator, in his own right, it doesn't say here, Ken Liu. Ken Liu is the translator. He's a science fiction writer, an American science fiction writer, and he does good stuff as well. Yes, sir.
I would say The 100 is also, it's on Netflix. It's a TV show.
Yeah.
It's about like basically post-apocalypse where Earth is no longer inhabitable and the only people that survived, theoretically, is those that are in the space stations. I wouldn't call them space colonies. Like, you know how like there's right now one space station in space. Like there is a time where each country kind of has their own in that series, and then because they realize, because up in space you can see the mushroom cloud kind of. They just see multiple go off, and they're like, okay, well, Earth is done. Let's just come together and just live out in space. But then resources became thin, and they were like, okay, let's see if Earth is habitable again after like, I don't know, 100 years or so.
Cool.
And that's how the story goes on.
All right. 100 other suggestions. What are some other things you guys have seen recently or really favorite? Yes?
I don't know if this was mentioned already, but Black Mirror.
Black Mirror is an excellent example. It's like a modern day Twilight Zone, right? also put down Twilight Zone, so I mentioned it. Others.
Fifth Element by I think what's it called? Fifth, yeah. Bruce
John
Willis.
Renaud is in it, but who's the director's name? The neat thing about The Fifth Element, someone that I'm going to mention, I actually mentioned in our first class maybe, or our last class. At some point I mentioned it. Harlan Ellison, someone you want to put in your notes because we're going to be talking about him later this semester too. Just to maybe talk, think through some of like the connections. You're thinking of like the film The Terminator, from 1984. Harlan Ellison wrote a story called I think it's called The Glass-Handed Demon, and its premise is very similar to Terminator. So when The Terminator was produced and came out, Harlan Ellison sued to get like writing credit on that, even though like the screenplay writer director said that they weren't influenced by it. There were a lot of similarities, and ultimately they settled so that Ellison got credit on that. So you always see him in the credits now. But the reason I mention him here in this case with The Fifth Element is there's a big science fiction and fantasy convention every year called Dragon Con. Really big convention, takes place in downtown Atlanta over Labor Day weekend every year. I met Harlan Ellison there in 1999, and during his stage presentation when he was talking about science fiction, he gave a huge, really lauded The Fifth Element. And Harlan Ellison is when he was alive anyways, he was a very prickly bastard. Not to say that he wasn't a good guy, because I mean, in some ways, he was like one of the best type of science fiction writers as far as fans are concerned. Because like at that particular presentation afterwards, he was giving autographs. Everybody wanted an autograph from him. I'm talking like we're in this huge auditorium, and the line wrapped around the entire periphery of the auditorium and out the door. He stayed sitting there for like hours, meeting people, not just like signing, but like talking to people. He would talk to you and like interact with you. And a lot of people that are professionals like that, they don't do that. So I mean, I think in that regard, he was a really good guy. But he's also very cagey and also like not always giving like the best adulation to different science fiction he didn't like, but The Fifth Element he really liked. I think it has a lot of like really good stuff, and it's something that kind of harkens back, I think, to some of the older adventure-style science fiction that we'd gotten away from before it was made. Other things you guys are like, it could be like video games, it could be anything, comic books. You say?
Yeah, the trilogy of video games called Mass Effect.
Yes, Mass Effect. I mean, that's hugely popular, right?
Yeah. Last one was terrible though.
I mean, there's a lot of debate on that.
Yeah, that was terrible.
So Mass Effect and all these, a lot of those types of first-person shooter games that came out from like around that same era, like the Halo series. All these are like deeply rooted in science fiction ideas and science fiction stories. And in many ways, we can like trace back things like Halo and Mass Effect, even more modern shooters, back to stories like Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, not the film, the book. But Robert Heinlein, one of the very important golden age science fiction writers we're going to talk about later on, one of his books called Starship Troopers was really ahead of its time, not just in terms of its portrayal of war between like humans and quote unquote bugs, this insectoid type alien people that had attacked Earth, but also the fact that like he produced at a time when it was largely just totally unseen to have both, not both, but a fully integrated armed services, where the main character is Puerto Rican. You have men and women fighting together, like on the same service, at a time where we were still like, talking about, integration of armed services like in real life. So I mean, he was in that way forward thinking and showing how things might be in a different way than like what we see a little bit later on, like with Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, which tries to do it in a less like, kill them all, let God sort them out kind of way. But again, it's still like something where peoples and nations can work together in ways in science fiction that we can aspire to and that we try to work towards. Other examples you want to include? Yeah.
So I'm actually going to piggyback off of that story that you said, and there's a science fiction anime that is called Blue Gender, and it follows a story of a time period like right now, like the present, where we're still in the studies for cures for cancer, but we don't actually have a solid cure yet. So what happens is the people that are diagnosed with cancer, they get put into cryo. They wake up in the future, and all of a sudden the planet is like overran by like, I would say monsters, but what it turns out, these monsters are actually like genetically mutated experiments to try to, like, like how they have like rabbits and rats that they test on to like try to get a cure and everything. What happens is those test subjects mutate and then kind of just end up turning on the human race itself.
I see.
So these people that are in cryo start waking up in the future where it's like an apocalypse now.
Wait, that's a series on Hulu, isn't it? Is that a series on Hulu?
I'm not sure if it's on Hulu, but it's an old anime series that I've watched a while ago.
Hulu series on it.
Cool. I'll make a note here of that. And it reminds me of, again, getting this idea of like how science fiction cross-pollinates, that these ideas percolate, go around, circulate in culture. It makes me think of like 28 Days Later. It makes me think of like the Dune series, Half-Life series, where like experimentation of science run amok is like a key component of like how what drives the plot of the story. And that's actually what we're going to come back to today with Frankenstein. So how about like right now, 7:20? Let's take like a 10-minute break. So if you need to get a snack, drink, use the restroom, please do so. If you came in late or you missed the sign-in sheet, make sure you sign in. Always do that. Never forget to do that. And then we'll come back at a little at about 7:30, and we'll talk about Frankenstein. We're going to pick up on that idea of science run amok. Okay, let's go and get started back. Folks, bring in snacks. Just remember to clean up whenever we head out of here, so nobody like hollers at me about it later on. Okay, so to pick up where we left off last time, I believe I was talking about how Frankenstein was a science-saturated novel. But before we go into some of the last notes I wanted to give you about the novel, I wanted to find out like what you guys were thinking about it. Like your things, like did you like it? Did you dislike it? Do you have like trouble with certain passages, chapters, or maybe the book as a whole? What are some of your thoughts on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? Anything and everything is fair game.
I read Frankenstein my senior year of high school, which was like 5 years ago now. And I remember being like really hyped about it and like really excited. A lot of anticipation, but I couldn't remember why. And then when I revisited it in this class, like all of that came back. And I remember it was mostly because of the, I guess the dialect, because it's obviously not English that someone would be speaking now. But it's kind of, it makes me laugh a little, but I love the exaggeration and the way you can sort of really, like, you really get to envision through the details of the book. And I remember my teacher back in high school, she said, oh, this novel might seem very generic because of its themes and because of the way it goes, but this was very revolutionary at the time it was written. And then I thought to myself, still, it still doesn't seem generic to me, nor does it seem like something, everything I see now is kind of like being made now, you might think it's generic, but this story is timeless, I think. And I remember it being confusing as well, but really quick, what I would point out is that I like to read the books, like the audiobook, and then put the speed, and then read along with it. That way you stay really focused, but you also save a lot of time. Yeah, and that's honestly the best way I can recommend to anybody to read who wants to read a book. To just, well, they even have it on YouTube, like the whole 8 hours, but you can knock out in 2 hours, and 4 hours if you double the speed.
Right.
And then just 1 hour every day, you're done with the book. Yeah, I love the story, and I think I hope to revisit again in like, I don't know, I guess in another 5 years, but it's just like, it's such an amazing story, and again, it's just the exaggeration of the detail that really kind of grabbed me. And if you're not open to like really getting into it, it kind of sucks because I can understand how the vocabulary and how the dialect might like not be appealing to some, but you're really missing out like if you're not reading it because it's such a, I don't know, such a powerful story. I love it.
And do you think like with like these two experiences, encounters with the book, you point out like this importance of reading through it, reading the words, and are they painting a picture for you of the things that are taking place, of what's going on?
Yeah, I see a word used a lot. She uses animate, and like I'm an animation major. And so,
okay.
like when I think animation, just like I can just see myself like the exaggeration to another level, maybe to like who somebody who's not an animator, but yeah, it's just you need to see the words. I think it helps a lot, but yeah, I don't know. The words are very specific, and they really help to paint a picture.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I mean that, and props to your high school teacher, like you for assigning the work and also working through with you guys, because I think from my own experience I can say as well, like when you return to a work after time has passed, it's like it can still be a enjoyable experience, but what you've learned and how you've evolved as a person over time is going to change like the way your relationship to the book. It's going to change your relationship to anything, like movie, music, etc. So some thoughts. I think I saw you like nodding your head along with them. Like, what were some of your thoughts, Mike?
I agree with when he was talking about dialect. I'm also taking art history class, and a lot of the excerpts we have to read up from like the 1300s, and I have a hard time understanding it. I'm always looking at translation, like modern day language, just because it's so difficult, but in some extent it's not that bad. As like the 1300s, the way things are written, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, when we go way back there to like say Chaucer and around that time, I mean, Old English, it's almost like a foreign language. I mean, you're having to translate it into like what we would say today. Whereas like with Mary Shelley in that time, still several centuries ago, but at least it's a little more decipherable. And in some cases, like if you really get into the nitty-gritty of the words, there are some words that may have a slightly different connotation or different definition than the way we might use it now. Because I think like for today, like pointing out this word animate is very key to like our understanding of what's going on in Frankenstein. That Mary Shelley's working from dead matter, meaning like your dead body parts. In many ways, we don't really get to see it so much in the descriptions because I think that for her, she knows that her audience is going to be aware of the reality of death in a way that's probably a lot different than our relationship, for most of us anyways, today. Because today we have so many systems in place for like if someone passes away, for dealing with the body that wasn't the way necessarily it was handled back then. And so people would have had a much closer relationship with death for that reason, but also because, I mean, you didn't live that long back then either. And so this idea of animate, of being able to bring something that was once dead back to life is something we don't see so much today, but at that time it would have a certain connotation that I think would have been eerie to her audience. in a way that for us today, it has this different connotation of like animation, making something that you can be like joyful too. You know, it can be something that's really, something that can engage us in different ways. Everything from like, an anime to westernized animation, etc. So I think these points that you're bringing up about words, the challenge of deciphering them, but also some of those keywords that jump out at us that get repeated a lot. There's a reason they get repeated a lot. She wants us to pay attention to those. Other thoughts you guys have? Anything at all? Can be related to this? Can be other things that you guys want to bring up?
I thought it was interesting reading something that I was so familiar with over time. Like everyone knows who Frankenstein is. I never read it. Never occurred to me to read it. I didn't think it would be that good, but it exceeded expectations. And I thought that it was a big difference is the way the creature is portrayed because he's very human in the book, but you get the image of the guy with the black hair.
Right, exactly. And this is the good point that you're raising about how I think influential Frankenstein is and how remarkable that this story from 1818 has stayed with us this long so that it can be a part of our popular culture. Maybe resurrected in some ways, no pun intended, for the films, adaptations, the way that it's influenced different works of science fiction, so that we're all kind of intimately familiar with the story and the characters, but we all might not have read it yet until now, for all of us in here. And I think that's a remarkable aspect of the story, that it isn't something that's been forgotten. Because if you imagine, even going back to the birth of the novel and mass publication with Gutenberg's press, is that there have been a shit ton of books published over the years. I mean, I can't stress that enough. How many books have been published in the past, and how many more books get published every day, much less every year today. So for a book like this not to disappear, because all those books that have been published, think, imagine how many you guys don't know about, much less I know about, someone who studies books for a living, right? So I mean, so many of these things just get forgotten because they don't have that impact on our culture the same way that Frankenstein has. So that it's something that I think almost everybody can be familiar with in some way without even having read the book. But then by reading it now, you get to delve into like why it's been something that's had that lasting effect on us. So these are some really great points that you guys are raising. Other thoughts that came up, reactions to the novel. Yes, sir.
I think the monster was a victim, and the real monster was society that was unaccepting of him.
I think it's a really good point that in some of the modern adaptations of Frankenstein, sometimes maybe disregards, it doesn't like explore as much as Mary Shelley does, is the fact that Victor Frankenstein makes this creature, and what does he do? After it's reanimated, what does he do? He runs away. He's like, fuck this, I'm out of here. And that's like the worst thing who can do. Like if you were to think today, like someone that creates life, what do we call that person? A parent. And yes. But in both cases, what should they not do? They shouldn't run away, right? But Victor Frankenstein makes life and he runs away from it. And he's abhorred by what he's made. He totally, and I think the thing is, like, he says that he's like horrified in this thing, that he finds it grotesque. But the fact is, he has a responsibility to that creature that he's made. But he just like gives up on it, runs away, and when it's disappeared, when he comes back with Clerval, he's like, okay, well, whatever. I'll go on with my life until things happen later on. And I think the thing is that the creature was a victim here. And I think Mary Shelley was very smart in the way that she's drawing on some of the at least the science of her time, of linguistics and of thought, And this idea that I mentioned before of the blank slate last time, this idea that when we're born, we have in our mind a blank slate, that we're starting from nothing. And it's through our ability of reason that we're able to learn things, that we're able to be rational, that we're able to make choices and decisions. And we see that happen with the creature. After he's like, staggered out, like when he's recounting his tale to Frankenstein, and he staggers out of the apartment where he was made, and he begins like, observing things. He's like, a fucking biologist at this point. He's like making observations of what his eyes are now able to focus on. And he's trying to make sense of like, of assuaging his pangs of hunger and finding out there's some things he could eat, other things that he couldn't, that he needed to drink water. He's able to then, later on, once he meets the DeLacy's, what does he do through that little peephole in the place that he hides? What's the really remarkable thing that the creature does? He learns to speak. He learns language. And it's with language that a whole other world opens up to him in terms of learning about how the way the world works. Because not only is he able to like follow along with what the DeLacy's are doing in their hovel and learning from them and what they say, but he's also able to begin reading those books that he finds in that cloak that he discovers, right? These were important works, both the fiction and the philosophy of that time. And they helped him begin developing a mind. In a sense, like what we would say, he's a human mind, because he's made from human body parts, sewn and stitched together by Frankenstein's hand to create this creature that is human-like in appearance, but bigger and also a little more rotten. Because you have to imagine at that time, Victor Frankenstein is like going into charnel houses, places where there are dead bodies. He's digging up body parts from graveyards or paying people to do that. And it's all these parts, like, in a sense, almost like, I wouldn't say as simple as Lego bricks, because he's wanting to exaggerate the human form so it's easier to work with. Because today you might have seen like on science programs on TV, like brain surgery. Like the neurosurgeon is sitting over the patient whose head has been exposed, like their brain has been exposed. And they're looking into like microscope down at the brain tissue. And then they have special remotely controlled pincers and other types of instruments that they control. Partially, you might think of it almost like a fly-by-wire system on like a fighter jet, that their movements are mediated by computers and control systems to operate on these very delicate pieces of the human brain. Well, Victor Frankenstein didn't have that back then. So if he's going to be putting together body parts, he needs to work with something bigger. He has to make it a little more outsized than like what the normal human proportions would be. And again, that's part of what brings the abhorrence to his eyes, beyond the fact like this is essentially like a zombie that he has reanimated. The flesh would have already been decaying, etc. You imagine this like refrigeration and all this kind of stuff. It would be pretty rank. But nevertheless, he still has a responsibility to this thing, that he decided to do this, and he shirks that responsibility, and the creature goes off trying to make the best of things, using his mind, using the power of rationality to try to make sense of this place in the world.
I think the author uses a lot of emotion in the creature as well. They have feelings, and he's depressed about his state.
This is really key, because whenever we're confronted with affect, with emotion of a character, do we try to empathize? Like as human beings? Like if I see you crying, are I going to be like, Why is Leroy crying? I don't want him to cry. That's no good. Same thing is happening with the creature. We're like seeing his sorrows, and we are meant to empathize that these things that society are like bringing on him because they don't understand what he is, or like why he's so strange in terms of appearance. Nevertheless, we're meant to like empathize with him. So if we were in his position, then we wouldn't want to be treated like that. We don't think anybody should be treated that way. I mean, for only trying to attempt a connection with others, which is what he tries, but then that doesn't work out. Other ideas, other reactions you guys had to the story? Anything and everything, very good.
I had watched, I don't know how factual it is, but it's the Mary Shelley movie with Dakota Fanning, but her sister, her younger sister. They did a movie about Mary Shelley. I don't know how factual it is because Hollywood dramatizes and stuff. But I rewatched it while reading the book, and it sort of goes into her younger years surrounding the context of when she wrote the book and going to the house in Geneva with Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, and sort of like the drama that was happening around the context of how the story became. And it was interesting because I guess Lord Byron had an affair with her sister and then impregnated her, and then she had also lost her child by Percy, and like all these terrible things were happening to her at the time. And then she wrote this novel, and then in the story, her sister read it and told her, because Lord Byron, I guess, had abandoned her. And she said, I feel like Frankenstein is written about all of us who have been like sort of abandoned, which I think could possibly be true. But also, like, I thought that she was writing too about being a female at the time, because a lot of times society did abandon them. And that's where I feel like a lot of the emotion and feelings went into the character.
No, this is really good that you mentioned this, because I think a very strong case can be made about abandonment themes in the novel. And if you think, for Mary Shelley, like she had the ultimate abandonment whenever her mother died. You're following childbirth for her. And so there's stories of Mary Shelley visiting her mother's grave, and like she would just hang out there. I mean, people think goths were born out of like the 80s and 90s, but I mean, they go a long way back if we start thinking about like Mary Shelley. And so this idea of abandonment, I think, is really true, especially if you're thinking of like how prevalent death was at the time, because there's no antibiotics. I mean, if you get blood poisoning, I mean, you're just done. A lot of people died very young at that time, and then also later you have Percy Shelley dies out on a sailing trip on Lake Geneva shortly after after the novel was published. So I mean, death surrounds them, and I think not just for them, but for a lot of most people at that time in Europe in particular, probably everywhere. With this idea of abandonment, we do see that taking place with the creature, that he feels abandoned not just by his creator, but then by society in general. That like when he tries to make that connection, he gets slapped away, he gets yelled at. Everything goes wrong despite his best intentions. And that's really what's at the core of abandonment, is that people try to make connection, but then they get turned away. So I think that's a really good point to raise. Do you know that film is just called Mary Shelley? There's another film I probably would dissuade you guys from watching unless you just want to watch something kind of cheesy. I think it's called Gothic. It's from, I think, the early 90s. It's about that episode when Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, Dr. Polidori were in the cabin devising their ghost stories. I think it's very melodramatic. With Mary Shelley, the film, I don't know how accurate, but it sounds like it is talking about some of the factual points in her life. Gothic, don't bother with it unless you just really like watching cheesy stuff. But you may check out this Mary Shelley movie. I appreciate you mentioning that. And that's something else to keep in mind as we go through the semester, not just about Frankenstein, but other things that we're going to be reading. If you find like either a website, a film, TV show, anything that may be relevant to what we're talking about, and you want to share it out, let me know or mention it in class, and that way we can broadcast it so other people can check it out, because it may be something that'll help you out some. Because not just are you offering something to others, but others will be offering things to you as well. These things that you're saying are like spot on. I appreciate you guys giving the story some thought to come up with this, and also revisiting the novel if you've read it before. I mean, that's really what being a good reader is all about. And it's something that it took me a long time to figure out, is that by returning to something, just like whenever you watch a movie again for like a second or third time, you find things, you see things you didn't notice the first time around. Same is true like video games. I mean, like many years ago, like when Final Fantasy VII first came out for PlayStation 1, I played the game and I remembered certain things about it. But more recently, like maybe 2 years ago, I played through the game again on an emulator on my computer. And there's so much of the story that I either don't remember or that I just totally glossed over, because my engagement and what I know now is different than like what it was back in the day, the first time that I encountered the game. All right, so right now it's almost 8, so let me just mention a couple of notes I want you to have about Frankenstein to wrap this up. And then in our next class, just to give you a heads up, you will be continuing on with the syllabus. And so let me just bring it up so I can tell you now as a reminder of what you want to take a look at. So for our next class, that'll be next week, February 26th, I got 2 stories for you linked on our syllabus. The first is the abridged version of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. It's abridged, it's like a shorter version, so it doesn't go into as much detail as in the longer novel, which I think I've looked at and I think is fine. If you have time, you can read the whole thing. The main story points are in the abridged version, but there's a lot more depth in the novel. The novel itself isn't very long. I just went with the abridged version also because I wanted us to have 2 contrasting writers for next week. So we have H.G. Wells' The Time Machine abridged. And what's cool also about The Time Machine, just like Mary Shelley gives us this essentially a template, a prototype for a science fiction story that involves a lot of different elements of science and technology and the effects those things have on individuals and society. But H.G. Wells is also what we might call a prototyper of different kinds of science fiction. So before H.G. Wells, there were other types of time travel stories, but almost always they involve some sort of magical, mystical element, or they involve like a Rip Van Winkle kind of story where someone like falls asleep and wakes up 100 years in the future, which again is also kind of fantastical. Wells is the one that said, what if we had technology that could help us travel through time as if time's another dimension, getting back to Einstein, which were ideas that were circulating, because time machine comes before Einstein's special and general theories of relativity, but these were ideas that were circulating at the time. And then that second story is E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. If you need to prioritize your reading, like let's say you got a lot of things going on this next week, The Machine Stops is the story I would prefer you read through completely. It's a much more important story, I think, for many of you guys here at City Tech and the different majors you represent, because E.M. Forster, in that story from 1909, presents ideas that were very prophetic. I'm talking about things like internet, video conferencing, climate control systems, feedback systems, all these kinds of things that hadn't been invented yet. He brings into the story to kind of show a world where we become very dependent on our technology, and he tries to imagine what happens if this technology we depend on for our very comfortable lives suddenly stops working, and nobody is prepared or has the knowledge to fix the things. So it's very catastrophic. It's a tough story because of some of the subject matter, but prioritize the machine stops. If you read both stories, please do. But if you need to prioritize, definitely get through the machine stops first. Because that's the one that I think will have the most meaning for you. But you need to be aware of Wells also. And we're going to talk about both. So, also keep in mind, after today's class, I'll be posting this video up on our Open Lab site so you can have it for a reference. But before our next class, respond to that blog post with the video, letting me know in basically about 250 words, what were some of the main points that maybe we discussed, things you remember, maybe some things you remember from Frankenstein. It can be a mixture of those things. Because again, I'm not looking for anything in particular. I don't want anybody to get hung up on those weekly writings as me like expecting a particular point from you. I want it to be you showing me what are some of the things that you paid attention to that you think are important, and so that you get that writing practice. Some of this is also building us up for the longer writing project at the end of the semester with that research essay. All right, so to close things up with Frankenstein. So in our last class, I talked about it being a science-saturated novel. And remember, with it being a science-saturated novel, that it involves the three main characters. Remember, we open with Walton. It's an epistolary novel, meaning it's letters written between Walton and his dear sister. We have Victor Frankenstein, right, who is training to be a scientist. But remember, I mentioned before that what really marks this as the first science fiction novel is that Victor makes a choice between alchemy, which is like, you know, the magical pseudoscience of making potions, of transmuting base metals like lead into gold, which, you know, you can't do that. I mean, that would require a nuclear process. And you don't have any idea about that. So it's the choice between alchemy and science. Sorry about my handwriting. But this idea that he realizes, you know, from his teacher, Waldman, the chemist, that, you know, science is really the way forward. That alchemy is just a bunch of bullshit. It won't let you do the things that it claims that you're able to do. But Victor realizes that with science and experimentation and being able to use these new technical apparatuses of his day, that he's able to uncover, he's able to discover how life works, how inanimate matter, like the things that we're made of, are imbued with life. How is the human given life? And then finally, we got the creature. Creature, never given a name, but the being that Victor creates. And the creature is also a scientist in a sense because he uses his reason to try to figure things out. He's able to teach himself things. He's able to learn from others, you know, surreptitiously. He's able to try to reason things out. And in some cases, he even tries to improve upon his theories. Because if you remember with the DeLacy's, he first plans out in his mind how he's going to try to confront the old man DeLacy. Because he knows that the guy's blind, so maybe he's not going to, you know, freak out about like how he looks, but that he could try to reason with him as one person talking to another. But when everything goes wrong and he's beaten off by the sun, afterwards he tries to plan out, he's thinking in his mind, well, maybe if I do try it differently this next time, tweak things a little bit, He's modifying his theory, just like a scientist would. But ultimately, he doesn't get to put it into play because then the DeLacy's move away, because they're like so freaked out.
When you're a parent and you have a child, one of the first things you do is you give the child a name. Why wasn't this creature given a name?
Because immediately Victor runs away and washes his hands of his creation. He's a terrible father. I mean, like the worst kind of father. I mean, to totally turn your back on essentially a helpless being that you've made really shows like how Victor is, in many ways, just a worthless human being. I mean, I can like make fun and say like he whines a lot, which he does, but he's also like, you know, just like the worst example of how a human being ought to be. That you should take responsibility for your progeny, which is what the creature is. But you know, there are other things that maybe to consider is like how there are some aspects of the creature's making by Frankenstein that are unnatural. Because like if we're talking about birth, of making a human child, obviously a man and woman have to be together, at least there are obviously scientific interventions today to help with that. But just straight biology, you need a man and a woman. And a woman gestates the child in her womb until giving birth. Women give birth. But in this case, what happens? A man gives birth. It's a very unnatural birth. And I think that in many ways, Victor is someone who is incapable of caring for this child. Maybe the way that a woman might, I don't know. But regardless of that, he's still a very like irresponsible person.
He's like really, really foolish. And he has so many chances to.
Exactly. I mean, he could to save lives, to make good on what he had done. But he keeps like running away from it. He's just like shouting essentially expletives at the creature. I mean, those kinds of words that he's calling the creature at that time would have been like essentially like curses. And yes, I mean he got these chances, but he always like disregards them. No thoughts? Okay. So the last things to mention. So we talked about Victor, choose rationality, all that. Biology of mind. I'm going to skip over. Don't think that's necessary for this. Cognitive effects. These two things, these will be two last points I think that you guys ought to have in your notes. So one aspect of the novel that you guys ought to think about, and maybe how it comes up in other science fiction you may already know or that we'll talk about this semester, is this idea of hubris. Anybody know what that means? Heard that word before? Hubris. Nothing? No? Yeah.
It's essentially like your overconfidence.
It's like really super overconfident about like your abilities, right? So another way to put it is that hubris is presumption or behavior perceived as arrogant, disrespectful, and transgressing the limits of what is permitted or appropriate. It is pride and excessive self-confidence. So this idea is a real old one. Okay, so from Greek mythology, hubris is presumption or arrogance toward the gods. Essentially like human beings saying like, I can do whatever the hell I want. God's telling me I can't do this, well fuck them, I'll do it anyways. And in Greek mythology, there was this one god called Nemesis. Nemesis is the inescapable, who would avenge or punish those seen as hubristic. And now Nemesis, he would go after like not just human beings, but also other gods. And I mentioned before, and you know with the title of this work, Prometheus had hubris toward Zeus. Zeus, Z-E-U-S, who was he?
Father of gods.
Yeah, he's like the top dog, the father of the gods, the king of the gods. And Zeus had decreed humanity did not deserve fire. But Prometheus thought he knew better than Zeus. And he was punished for giving fire to humanity and for his arrogance towards Zeus. You might have heard, like if you've read the Bible before, in Proverbs 16:18, quote, "Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall." This idea of hubris is like embedded in our mythologies, our belief systems. And then in terms of the novel, Frankenstein has hubris. Frankenstein thinks that his insight and discoveries give him the superior authority to decide to create his creature. He does not take the time to stop and think about his act's ramifications to others, or, as we were just discussing, his duty toward the creature. Because if we create life, if we have a baby, we have a certain duty to take care of it, to protect it. But Victor Frankenstein is like all kinds of wrong about everything involving the creature. And then, in terms of the story, the creature serves as Frankenstein's what? If we think of that Greek mythology, what does the creature become? Nemesis, exactly. He serves as Frankenstein's nemesis, the inescapable agent of someone's downfall due to their hubris. If we think of, like comic books. You think of like the arch enemy. This is the nemesis of the main character, the protagonist. Especially like you're thinking about like some of the later Batman comics, that came out of the 80s and early 90s, such as Frank Miller's, The Dark Knight Returns, thinking of The Killing Joke. I mean, with these stories, the writers make it very apparent that for Batman really to exist, there has to be this opposite. There has to be some sort of nemesis. They kind of work off of one another. There can't be one without the other. And this is kind of the same operation that's taking place in a much more mythologically rooted way in the novel Frankenstein. Now, the last thing I wanted to discuss briefly with you guys is how the novel is a critique of the Age of Enlightenment. How the novel is a critique of the Age of Enlightenment. So just as much as Mary Shelley is writing this story that extrapolates what is known at the time about chemistry and galvanism and biology to imagine how science could be used to reanimate dead life and make it alive again. She's also using the story to provide some commentary about essentially some of the ideas and beliefs that were coming out of the Age of Enlightenment. And again, just a reminder, the Age of Enlightenment, from my first video lecture, is that time where essentially we developed the idea of science. It's when we developed ideas about reason and rationality and skepticism, of questioning the status quo, so that we could think of other possibilities and do new things that we weren't capable of before. But as much as those things have a lot of positive aspects to them, if there's not a questioning of like the goal or why we're doing it or what are the effects of those things, just the same way that Victor Frankenstein isn't questioning what is the effect of making this creature, what's going to happen to the people around him, what are going to happen to others. The same way that Victor Frankenstein isn't questioning those implications, Mary Shelley's also, by extension, showing that as great as science is, that we also have to think about those implications. We need to think about what is the effect of science and technology on individuals in society. That core idea that we started with at the beginning of class when we were looking at those definitions is thinking about what is the effect of these things on us. Because ultimately all these stories are about us in some form or fashion. So as a critique of the Age of Enlightenment, we can think of it as knowledge from science and rationality can have positive and negative effects on society. Like, we can think of like two big contrasts. Like on the one hand, like the sciences of immunology, right? Of being able to make immunizations to protect us from diseases. That's a really good aspect of like science and technology. Yeah.
Now you're headed what I was thinking. I met someone in the medical field. I guess it was at one point a sort of science fiction and now reality. The medication that they give out is no longer distributed on a generic basis, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams. It's now being distributed based on your DNA. So they're going to use your DNA to make a decision as to how they're going to prescribe certain medications for individuals.
Oh, in like a very targeted kind of way.
Right,
like
called genome.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, that's kind of like the next stage of a lot of these medical developments.
Mm-hmm.
But if we think back just a little bit, though, with like immunization, which is kind of an older technology, that same kind of technology that underpins how we make immunizations can also be used to make biological weapons. So it's like, on the one hand, we use these processes to save us. But if used in a bad way, they can hurt us. Yeah.
It's going to add like with nuclear power and nuclear weapons.
Exactly. That's exactly the same kind of contrast. In the one case, it can provide us virtually unlimited energy, but on the other, it can be a terribly destructive weapon. So I mean, this is the kind of thing that Mary Shelley is trying to get people to think about at the beginning of the scientific, or not really the beginning, but like as the scientific revolution is gaining steam. She's saying, we need to stop and think about these things. What are the implications? I don't think that necessarily she's saying we should stop, but that we should always question. To maintain that spirit of the Age of Enlightenment, that we should have a skepticism toward the things that we're doing, as much as skepticism of the past. Yeah, so right now it's 8:19. I think those are the main points that I want us to get through that I think are like the most relevant to you guys. There's obviously a lot more that can be said about Frankenstein, the novel. And just to keep in mind that that research essay that you're going to have to work on that's due at the end of the semester, it needs to be a work that you choose that we don't actually read in the class. But you can still write about whatever you choose in relationship to some of the things that we read in class. So you might choose a work that connects to Frankenstein in some way, and that could be a part of your discussion. We'll talk more about that later, maybe in the next, maybe in a couple of weeks from now, we'll start talking about the research essay, because obviously I want to give you plenty of time to work on it. Also time that you can touch base with me to let me know what your idea is, and we can like hone it down, make sure it's very focused, and that is going to give you a lot of things to write about. Because I don't want anybody to get in a bind like at the end of the semester. That's not the way to write a good research paper. And I definitely want to build it into our class to give you the best potential for success on it. So keep in mind, before our next class, you have the 2 reading assignments. You have the 1 weekly writing to write about like 250 words based on our discussion today and what you've read in Frankenstein. You can post that on OpenLab on the post that I'll make. Let's not say it's going to be up tonight because I'm really deep right now. I will get that post up tomorrow because I need to edit the video before I put it up. So that way you can refer back to it as you finalize your notes. And I don't think I'm forgetting anything else. Make sure before you guys leave that you sign the sign-in sheet. As I need to go put in the verification of attendance after class before I go home. And I guess that's everything. If you guys got anything else, you stick around, ask me questions. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Remember, I got office hours right before class or by appointment. You can email me and we can set up an appointment.